Thank you, firstly, to the organisers for facilitating us in this session. This is the last of the plenary breakout sessions. So thank you to everyone in the room who chose to spend your last precious session with us. We know we're spoilt for choice at this conference, so we appreciate you spending this hour with us. So my name's Lauren Sanders. I'm from the University of Queensland, and if I were you, I also would have chosen this panel because I'm joined by 4 experts in the area of artificial intelligence and export controls, which is the subject matter of our panel today. In addition to being experts, we have a wide region of experts presented on the panel, covering off on US, European and Asian export control challenges in relation to military artificial intelligence. And what we're intending to focus on is the interplay between this existing control mechanism, what needs to change in relation to export controls, and the challenges of responsible AI in the military domain. We consider that this is an area that has received perhaps less attention in the context of discussions at places like REAIM, although debate about how artificial intelligence challenges existing export control regimes is very much alive in other discourse and other areas. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mark Bromley, who's on the screen. We were fortunate enough to share an office for the last 12 months, but he's now returned to colder climates and joining us from the Stockholm Institute of Peace and Research Institute. He's actually joining us at 5 o'clock in the morning, so a special thanks to Mark for joining us at such an inhospitable time. Also on the screen we have Andrea Visky, who's joining us who's the director of the Strategic Trade Research Institute. She's fortuitously in the same time zone, unlike normal, because she's actually joining us from another conference, so she's had to step out of that to participate in today's panel. So thank you, Andrea, for joining us. And in the room I have another member of the SIPRI team, with Jules Palia, who is our AI and policy expert. And then finally, but not at all least, we have Hyuk Jung, who's joining us from the Korean Institute of International Economic Policy, and he is an AI policy and expert controls expert, also focusing not just on the Korean policies, but the US and European policies as well. Promoting responsible use of military AI extends to ensuring that the underlying software and components that support the development of these capabilities aren't transferred to irresponsible actors. And this is the primary aim of the existing multilateral export control regimes, and then further national export control measures. So we want to talk today about the possibilities and limitations of export controls to capture and regulate the transfer of softwares and components that are relevant to military artificial intelligence. But firstly, before we get into that discussion, I just want to have a quick overview of our existing export control regimes and obligations just to frame our conversation. The existence of export control regimes are primarily enacted at the domestic level, but are derived from really 2 competing areas. The first is national policy in terms of protection of economic and security interests, and the other is the multilateral and international legal obligations that are imposed by a number of treaty and multilateral instruments that impose existing export control obligations. So the most relevant of those are the Missile Control Technology Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Wassenaar Arrangement, and the Australia Group, where we see that novel technologies are already being controlled, but further to that, we're also seeing a proliferation of domestic and multilateral agreements in relation to the control of specific kinds of technologies relevant to military AI, such as semiconductors. And the domestic rules and implementation of these export control regimes are really focused on giving that balance in relation to domestic security considerations and those international legal obligations. So the intent of this panel is to have a discussion to draw on the expertise of these experts, which will follow with a question and answer session. But before we get into the depth of the panel, we're going to have 3 parts to our conversation. The first is really an overview or strategic look at how it is that military AI has particular challenges or characteristics that challenge export control regimes. After that, we're going to talk about how those challenges are approached by states in terms of existing export control regimes. And then finally, we're going to talk about what options exist in terms of overcoming those particular challenges. So I'd like to turn to Jules first and ask you if you could provide us an overview of the role that AI currently plays in warfare and some of the potential side effects or ethical concerns that military AI poses.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's obviously a lot to unpack, and as you said, we're going to focus on export control. So I'll try to be as brief as possible on that question. And to give maybe a synthesized version of AI's impact, we can see that there are like two main effects of AI on international security, and that's quite a claim. But the first one would be AI's impact on the broader international security landscape in strategic terms, and I will come back to what I mean with strategic terms right now. And the second one would be AI's introduction into the means and methods of warfare. So for the first sort of like impact of AI on security, I mentioned the strategic element, and there is a perception that AI is a strategic technology. And when I say strategic, I mean strategic in a lot of different senses. In the military sense, and here we are talking about military AI in this conference, but also in the economic, industrial, and scientific sense. And if you remember, those who attended the inaugural session, the video that was displayed at the beginning showed like a lot of different examples of AI's application and how important AI is in all these domains that I just mentioned. And this strategic perception morphs into competition, and internationally speaking. And of course, competition is good, but to different degrees, competition can be bad. And this is seen in US-China relations, which I'm sure that we will be talking about a lot during the panel, but also increasingly with the adoption of national AI strategies, national AI defense strategies by different states that go beyond the US and China. And if we look at the effect in the security domain, specifically in the international security domain, we see that AI, broadly speaking, has an impact on a state sense of security, either by leading to an over-reliance on the technology and boosting a state sense of security, or by undermining a state's sense of security, leading to what could potentially be uncertainty or instability, and I will come back to this concept of uncertainty later on in the panel. And then the second effect that I was mentioning before, it's AI's introduction into means and methods of warfare, and this is a conversation that obviously raises a lot of ethical questions around human dignity, for example, and legal questions around international humanitarian law compliance. It's a conversation that has been dominated by autonomous weapon systems so far for the past 10 years, and that now slowly is getting more focused on other tools, such as AI decision support systems. And the reason why I mentioned these two branches is because I think the first one speaks to measures that can be taken in terms of strategic trade controls, which is the object of our session today. And the second branch that I mentioned, more on means and methods of warfare, speaks to humanitarian arms control, which is a bit less of our focus today. Yeah, and that I think sets the scene.
Thanks. I think that's an excellent. It is an excellent scene setter. So I think it's useful to frame our conversation now about the challenges that are posed to export control regimes by AI, because as you say, it's the domestic implementation of the, as you note, that it's the response of states to their security perceived risks that is a manifestation of how these export control regimes are then actually applied. So we've seen traditional export control regimes like the MCTR, the NSG, the Australia Group. They're focused on conventional weapons and weapons of mass destruction. So how do AI-enabled weapons compare to these kinds of traditional WMD multilateral controls? And what unique challenges are then posed for export controls by these AI-enabled weapons? And I'll direct this question to you, Hyuk.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Hyuk-Jun Kim. Thank you for attending the conference. So because I'm Korean, let me talk about the Korean perspective first, why having multilateral export control is important for our country, and then maybe some of the possible limitations with having this multilateral system. So I guess that there are a few Koreans here, so let me give you some Korean background, what is going on in this country. So our country, South Korea, we have a neighboring country called North Korea, or DPRK. Some of you having a smile, I know what that means. So the war has not ended yet. Officially, it is not ended. It's still going on, but we are just having a break. And then by that means that we have some military tensions between North Korea and the South Korea. And then one thing to note is that the gap between economic sizes of two countries is getting wider and wider as time goes on. The gap is like exponentially increasing over time. So for North Korea, it's very difficult to catch up the military expenses of the South Korea. So they tend to focus on asymmetric forces like nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, chemical, biological weapons, and so on. And those products are actually covered in those multilateral export control regimes like Wassenaar Arrangement and so on. So that's why those kind of agreements or multilateral system is very important to our very important to safeguard our national security. So that's starting point. Now, the thing is that there's new kind of asymmetric forces that is on the rise, which is AI-enabled military forces. Unlike like nuclear weapons, it's very difficult to launch the nuclear weapons here in Seoul, because that would mean another World War III that will happen like very soon. Okay, so however, AI-enabled attacks can happen at any time, especially when it is combined with cybersecurity attacks. Some study notes that about 40% of the GDP of North Korea is funded by cyber attacks, or some other studies from UN Security Council is noting that from like 2017 to 2023, North Korea reaped about like $3 billion using their cybersecurity attacks. So that's kind of a significant amount and very important for North Korean economy. Korea, the South Korea tends to get the most amount of attack from the North Koreans' cybersecurity attacks. Enabled with AI, it can be much more efficient to develop AI algorithms, and also with AI technologies enabled, it is very easier. It can be easier to bypass the security measures applied in the servers as well. So this is getting much. It is already a serious concern for the South Korea, and it will get more and more serious from now on as North Korea also adopts these kind of AI technologies. Then what should we do right now? So we have this multilateral export control system, but sometimes, like Wassenaar Arrangement, it has 40+ countries involved, and we need a unanimous approval to make a decision. But this AI technology is fast evolving. It's still at the initial stage of the development and application, and its speed of evolution is very difficult to catch up with the multilateral export control regime. So that's one thing. And also, compared to other kinds of arms, like nuclear weapons, there's so many countries and industries involved. The AI technology has, like, in the upstream is a semiconductor industry, which is already very large. And about 50 countries has their specialized areas in the semiconductor industry. So maybe some kind of technologies can be like substitutes for others, some can be complementary to others. So if we suppose that if we adopt a decision that is favored by Korea, South Korea's national security perspectives, maybe it can hurt the economic side of the other countries as well. So having some sort of agreement will be very, very difficult, especially in the AI domain. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think you touched on two of the key challenges really with all of export controls, which is the first being consensus and the broad range, or how broadly reaching particular multilateral regimes impact, because as you note, they're not universal agreements, they are just multilateral agreements with particular states that participate, and their effectiveness is contingent on the cooperation of those people those states that are participating in those regimes. And then the other issue you touched on is this issue of dual use and the proliferation of specific componentry that could be integrated into these systems, which is something that we've heard touched on across other sessions, noting this morning's session talked about some of the challenges by dual-use technologies. So, Andrea, did you want to add anything in relation to Hyuk's response in respect of how AI-enabled weapons challenge export control regimes?
Yes, thank you. And hi, everyone, and thanks again for having me on this panel. So I do have a couple of things to add, and I'm going to come at it from a little bit more of a bird's eye view, and kind of just talk about AI in the emerging tech space in general and how that has been handled so far in the multilateral regimes. So one of the challenges with emerging technologies is that previously the regimes operated by looking at the finished weapon and then dissecting what components and technologies and materials went into that finished weapon of concern, weapon of mass destruction in particular of concern where it comes to the multilateral export control regimes. And then they would take those different materials, equipment, and technology and put them on their respective control lists. With emerging technologies like AI, it's more difficult because often the ultimate end use and weaponization potential of these emerging technologies isn't always known. And therefore that presents more of a challenge because you don't necessarily know what the end use of what you might want to list is going to be. And as noted, it changes really quickly. And one of the other challenges in the regimes is that, as we've already discussed, even in the brief time of this panel, whereas the multilateral regimes each have their focus, so the focus of the nuclear suppliers group is preventing, nuclear weapons proliferation, and of the Australia group where it comes to bio and chemical weapons, etc. The different potential end uses and security threats of AI are often justified in ways that go beyond the scope of the regimes. So, for example, cyber attacks or use in disinformation or human rights violations, or as regards a new proposed bill in the US, it's based a lot on a commission that cites China using AI to prepare for a potential war with Taiwan. So when it comes to all of these other kind of technology protection or kind of security threats that actually go beyond the scope of the multilateral regimes, already because they work on consensus, it's very difficult to get consensus around controlling specific technologies if that tie to the WMD end use isn't clear, and if it's kind of muddled with these other potential sort of more unilateral security considerations. And then I'm going to talk about this perhaps later in the panel, but there's other kind of unilateral ways of control that, for example, catch-all controls or end-user controls, or controls on national origin technology that are able to that are certainly being introduced as a way to kind of buy time or find a solution to potentially controlling the technology, because it's not really possible at the multilateral level.
Thanks, Andrea. I think it's useful to think about that speed of regulation issue. And as you note, one of the key successes of the Australia group, which seeks to control biological weapons, is that because of the very distinct nature of biological threats and the expanse of risk of harm in terms of it being a weapon of mass destruction that has been recognised in a very firm international prohibition for an extended period of time, the ability of the Australia group to be successful has been in its speed of adoption of novel biological agents, but that is because it's such a discrete use for those particular agents that it could be readily agreed by the group. So Mark, I'll flick to you now and just ask you to give us an understanding of how these existing regimes are actually dealing with the issue of AI for military use, because we know there's been a number of approaches that have been adopted across the multilateral regimes to try and address some of the problem of these AI software and hardware issues.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And yeah, thanks for putting this together, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, Mark Bromley from SIPRI up here in Sweden. So if we talk, I mean, the point's already been made, but I think it's kind of worth underlining that when we talk about export controls, it is important to make a distinction between multilateral export controls and kind of unilateral export controls. So in terms of multilateral export controls, we're obviously thinking about the regimes, which Lauren and others have already mentioned. And I think in this space, particularly the Wassenaar arrangement is the one that we can think about most prominently. And here states are coming together and agreeing shared lists of items, which they all agree to make subject to their export controls, and then certain kind of normative concerns, which they all agree to make the basis for their export licensing decision making. So we have that's kind of multilateral export controls. And then we also have unilateral export controls where either individually or in much smaller groups, states are coming together and saying, these specific items which aren't on the list, we want to make that agreed at the multilateral level. We're going to make those subject to export controls. Or in some cases, these particular end users are the ones that we're particularly interested in targeting. So that's something that happens at the individual state or smaller group state level. And I think the other thing to kind of keep in mind in all of this is the purpose of export controls. Now, they're often thought about as being bans in some way of kind of like outlawing an existing technology, but I think that's kind of the wrong way to think about export controls. If a particular technology has been made subject to export controls, it's because states do not want to ban it. They view the trade in it as being legitimate, but the state wants to have some kind of oversight over where that technology is going and the ability in certain cases to step in and block a particular export if they want to. So they're not a means of banning things. They're a means of just generating some level of oversight for national governments. So that broad picture that I'm painting there is evolving a lot, particularly at the moment. So on the one hand, kind of geopolitical tensions are making it harder to agree the creation of new list categories at the multilateral level, which is in turn prompting states to act more in a kind of unilateral way in the field of export controls. And the second one, I think, is, to be very, blunt, there are concerns in the US, to a lesser extent in Europe, about these processes of civil military fusion in China, which are making them more interested in using export controls in a more targeted way, in the sense of trying to prevent certain types of technology from reaching China that could then benefit their military capabilities, particularly in the field of AI. So just to kind of, that's the very kind of broad picture of what export controls are. How do export controls already apply to AI, both at the multilateral and the unilateral way? Well, there's two ways that that's happening. So firstly, on the software level, so the control lists that are adopted in the regimes, they already capture AI software and technology that's been specially designed for use in a military system. So if you're in the defense sector and you're developing some kind of AI application with the intention of using it in connection with a military system, then that's already covered by the regime control lists. And a lot of the kind of disconnect between people who actually work on export controls and people who are pushing for export controls to be more prominent in this space has been kind of stymied by the fact that a lot of states feel that the software controls they already have already give them a decent level of oversight in terms of what the military sector is doing in this field. They already feel like they have sight of what the defense sector is doing if it's trying to develop an AI application for use in a military system. So that's the multilateral level. There are new unilateral kind of software controls that have emerged in recent years. And I think Andrea's already mentioned, I think I made reference to the kind of end use controls that the US has adopted. So if you're developing a software application and supplying it to a military or security end user in China, then you are potentially subject to US export controls. So that's software controls happening at the unilateral level. And then the second level to think about export controls and how they're operating here is in terms of hardware. And again, you have things at the multilateral and the unilateral level. So on the multilateral control lists, chips and computers that operate at a certain level of sophistication and might potentially be very useful in the AI space, they're already captured by the regime control lists, particularly the very high-end equipment. But then again, there are additional things happening at the unilateral level. And I think we can all think of the kind of the agreement between Japan, the US, and the Netherlands to adopt new controls on very sophisticated semiconductor manufacturing equipment. That's something that was happening at the unilateral level outside the regimes, but was particularly motivated by an attempt to capture technology that would be particularly relevant for AI applications. So I think that's the kind of broad picture in terms of what's missing there. And I think this maybe be picked up later. What we're talking about really is things that are happening in the military sphere. So things that are being developed within the military domain. What's not captured by export controls is things like foundational models, things which are being developed within the civilian space and which might later be deployed in the military field. And the question there is, to what extent can export controls be useful there? And I think what we'll be talking about later is they can be useful to a certain extent, but only really in combination with other kind of governance instruments, because that level, you're starting to get into fields where export controls can potentially be less useful because it's harder to kind of really target the specific technology that you're interested in an efficient way. But I'll pass back to Lauren. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We'll come back to that issue in relation to the ability to target AI technologies. But at the moment, I think it might be useful for us to do a bit of a deep dive in relation to the hardware issue and the semiconductor controls you talked about, because I think most people in the room are aware that there has been a particular focus in export controls unilaterally and discussions about the need for multilateral controls in relation to semiconductors. So Jules, I'll go to you first just to explain why semiconductors, what is the significance of this particular kind of technology in the context of military AI discussions?
So semiconductors are key because basically this technology on which all this AI conversation that we are hearing these days relies on. And the problem is that it's not one type of semiconductor. So we cannot come up here with a list of types of semiconductors that should be controlled, and then that's it, we've solved the military AI governance issues. It's unfortunately it depends question when it comes to what type of semiconductors are needed. And the bottom line is that we are missing a key technological choke point, and semiconductors sometimes are portrayed as this technological choke point, but if you scratch a bit the surface, then you see that it's a bit more complicated than that. I said it depends, and it depends, I think, on two main elements, which is one is the amount of compute needed, and then is if you are talking about a military platform, where the compute is done. So these two things are key to determine the type of semiconductors that you need. And also an important thing to note is that you don't always need the most high-end technology in military AI. So if we think about what I said about where the compute is done, if you think about an uncrewed vehicle, for example, there is a constant engineering issue when developing platforms like that, which is the swap problem. So the size, weight, and power problem. And the type of semiconductor that you use has an impact on this engineering problem, because depending on the semiconductor that you will be using and where the compute is done, you will need more power, then more weight, then maybe more size, and so on. And you need to balance out this equation. So this is why there is not a single straightforward answer to that question. And then the other variable that is important is the amount of compute that you need. And I said that you don't always need the most high-end chips to run military AI platform or systems. Though compute governance or the governance of the very high-end chips seems to be maybe taking off, or at least at unilateral levels, as Mark was mentioning before. And it's also something that has been mentioned, it's very difficult to differentiate between uses, like military uses and civilian uses of high-end compute. But we will come back to that maybe later on.
Thanks. It's always useful to have a however, comma answer. I think that's the great lawyer's answer, but it really is one of the challenges in relation to this space, is because it's when we think we've identified a solution to the problem, it turns out actually, because of the nature of the speed of change in technology, that it's not necessarily going to be the right answer for an extended period of time. And in this particular area, I always go back to the cell phone analogy, thinking, you know, when I was a kid, your dad had a brick in the car, and that was the mobile phone that you could pick up, and it had to have a car battery to make it work. And now we think about what we're carrying around in our pockets every day. So, Andrea, I want to turn to you and just ask you if you could talk about how the US in particular has been addressing this issue of semiconductors, and how other states are trying to address some of these emerging technology challenges through their export control systems.
Sure. I'll touch a little on the semiconductors, but I also kind of want to take the opportunity to link it to unilateral controls that the US has recently proposed, or just as recently as yesterday, related to AI systems. So, but I'll, again, take a step back. And so in the US context, in 2018, there was a big reform of the US export control system. And one of the components of that reform was that the US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security was tasked with identifying new controls on specific emerging technologies. So, AI is one of them, but also there's others: additive manufacturing, quantum computing, and I think apart from that, at least 10 others, and also subcategories. And as a matter of policy, the initial step would be to try to get any new controls controlled at the multilateral level. However, barring the ability to do that, the US sort of decided it's able to control these unilaterally, even if it would try to get them controls done multilaterally. If it can, it's still gonna go forward and do it unilaterally, based on their own calculations of their security threat. And so we saw a couple of new controls, in fact, introduced at the multilateral level based on that are just very specific. But then what we really saw is that in 2022, the US introduced these new controls on advanced manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing equipment and technology. And then those in recent years have been subsequently tightened. And then in parallel to this, the US has been working with like-minded partners and like Netherlands and Japan and Korea to align controls in this respect. And also in recent months, we've seen more of an alignment and public statements on alignment with these countries on controls that even go beyond semiconductor manufacturing equipment to other areas like quantum. But with respect to AI, you don't really have unilateral controls on the systems that the US is currently proposing to control. So in May, the US introduced what's called the Enforce Act. So it was proposed by a bipartisan coalition, and it hasn't been signed into law. But if it is passed, it would give BIS the legal authority to export control AI systems, and also to have some kind of authority to use US persons control on activities that US persons conduct in relation to these covered AI systems. So, for example, it would allow security checks for collaborating with Chinese labs. And then just yesterday, the Bureau of Industry and Security just introduced this new proposed rule. So again, this is a proposed rule where they are thinking of perhaps doing this, but they want comments first. They want feedback from industry. And this is actually related to what would be a mandatory reporting requirement for the world's AI developers, for leading AI developers and cloud providers, that would give them a reporting requirement to talk about any potential military applications or the advancement of the technology to the Bureau of Industry and Security. And one might ask, well, how is this like within the competence of the licensing agency? But it essentially, I think the objective is that based on the information that is gathered through this reporting requirement would allow BIS to assess any potential new controls at the unilateral or multilateral level.
Thanks, Andrea. And the speed of change in this area always astounds me, with the number of new proposals and changes to export control regimes, both as the regimes as a whole, as well as the specific items that are being sought to be controlled. So in relation to the semiconductor issue, again, noting that it had previously been identified as a choke point for AI technology, but not necessarily proving to be the case. John, you've got some comments to make about the potential multilateral nature of semiconductor controls. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Yeah. So, So as Mark has already noted, we have Japan and a Dutch government that is now participating in the semiconductor export controls. So, and I think the U.S. is now trying to expand the list of countries that is having some similar levels of semiconductor export controls, such as Germany, Korea, and so on. And I just want to touch on the limitations or difficulties when we try to expand the list of countries in this system. Now, first is this conflict of interest, or this clash of interest between the private companies and the government. Government seeking for national security, but the private companies are not always interested in those kind of issues. So, like back in 2015, when Obama administration was imposing semiconductor export controls to China, to certain supercomputing centers in China, what happened was that the AMD, the US firm, was trying to collaborate with Chinese chip designers like Thatic, Sugon, Haigon, and so on. And then what happened 10 years after? So what we see right now is that the Tianhe, which is the most capable, the one has the most highest computing power in China, that has now domestic chips inside its supercomputers. So it used to use chips from Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, but now they made chips called Matrix 2000, developed by NUDT, the National University of Defense Technology of China. So that's what we can kind of expect from the history. Okay, so we cannot control everything, every company, and every kind of actions. And private companies, whether it is Chinese or US firms, they will try to evade or try to find some small holes in the system that can give them profits. Now, this can also happen in the international level as well. So what we saw in last year, October 2023, when the US was expanding their semiconductor export controls, what they did was imposing some de minimis 0% of certain lithography equipment. And they were saying that countries that have similar level of export control to US will be exempted from this kind of de minimis 0% treatment. If you do not, what it means is that even if a very small amount is 0%, so if a very small amount, like 1 cent contribution of the US items, US controlled items, then that means that ASML, even if it is a Dutch company, it needs approval from the US BIS to export their lithography machines to China. So what can you expect from that is that this is not an official statement of the government, but what I'm suspecting is that there were some kind of differences in what the US government wanted to do and what the Dutch government actually did in their own export control system. And this is not just a one incident. I think it will just happen over and over again. When the US was expanding their commerce control list like 4 or 5 days ago. They also added like one sentence like, if you have some similar levels of export controls as per the US system, then those countries will be exempted from the export control license. And for like some other countries like Korea, you will be treated with presumption of approval. But I don't think that kind of treatment will be permanent. I see it as a warning sign of the US trying to expand this system, but the interest between countries, among countries, will be very different, and also yeah. Okay.
Thanks. That's a great point. I mean, Australia has signed on to the AUKUS agreement, which is the Australia-UK-US agreement in relation to accessing certain kinds of technology. Pillar 1 is in relation to the nuclear-propelled submarines, but Pillar 2 expressly includes artificial intelligence technologies. And one of the main issues the Australian government had complained about was the overheads of accessing US technology because of the extent of their export control regimes. But that, as you note, there's been a relaxation in relation to the requirement to get permits for interstate trade, noting, of course, that any further exports are still going to require the same kind of permits. Noting the time, I do want to perhaps focus a little bit more on how we can overcome some of these challenges in relation to controlling military use of artificial intelligence. So I'll flick to you, Mark, first, and just ask you. We've mentioned and we've touched previously on this idea of other complementary measures that might support export controls, and sanctions is obviously one we've seen that's been really highlighted in terms of Ukraine, and we've also seen, as we've mentioned, the overcoming of those sanctions in terms of just relying on less technologically advanced chips and semiconductors by Russian military agencies. But Mark, could you give us an overview of what you think these other measures might be to complement export control measures in the military AI space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, yeah. So if we think about, I mean, the kind of the point that's been made a couple of times that we seem to have, to a certain extent, export controls are able, or at least seeking, to kind of regulate what's happening within the kind of military domain. So obviously by that we mean defense and aerospace companies who are designing, military systems for use by states and are trying to integrate AI into that. So I think the stuff that's happening there, I think we have a sense that export controls are, already there and already kind of operating in that space and already kind of creating some level of oversight and control for the state where those systems are being developed. I think when we look beyond that, though, we're looking at what's happening within the kind of commercial sector, within the academic sector, who are developing kind of foundational models, or who are developing kind of more general use AI tools, which might later then be kind of picked up and repurposed as kind of military systems later. And to what extent can we kind of regulate that? And to what extent can we create some level of kind of awareness of those risks within that sector, and an ability and an interest in trying to see through the kind of end uses of the systems that are being developed there. I think as a kind of like on its own, kind of export controls is not going to be such a kind of great kind of instrument to operate there. You have risks in terms of kind of unintended consequences of trying to overregulate. You risk hoovering up a whole lot of stuff that you don't really want to have kind of oversight of, or create kind of barriers to its development. So some of the things that, and maybe Jules can speak to this more because him and his team have been looking at this a lot, are kind of models in terms of responsible research and innovation, and trying to, have researchers operating there, kind of thinking more about the kind of the risks of the systems that are developing. And I think when we're thinking about that, export controls can play a role, because the systems that have been developed at the multilateral level can be tools that can then guide the researchers in terms of thinking about what types of technologies are potentially of harm and of risk, because you can draw from the control lists that have been adopted at the multilateral level. to give you that insight and to give you that guide. You can also draw from export control agreements to think about the types of end use risks that can be of relevance. So in addition to kind of having these lists of technologies, what the regimes also do is come up with quite clear language on the potential IHL, misuse cases that can come up in connection with the delivery of military equipment, other human rights issues that can come up in terms of the use of exported military equipment. And that language can also then in turn be folded into these responsible research and innovation tools. And then lastly, the whole model that's kind of emerged within export controls and how industry kind of complies with export controls is based around this knowledge of internal compliance programs. And there's a lot of kind of good practice guides out there that specify how companies should go, what measures they should put in place in order to ensure that they're in compliance with export controls. And these concern, mapping what kind of technology the company is dealing with, ensuring they have oversight about who has access to that technology, ensuring that potential kind of points of kind of proliferation or leakage are kind of mapped and identified. And all of that can also be folded into and integrated within kind of responsible research and innovation models. So although, export controls aren't necessarily going to be the kind of policy tool which is going to solve the kind of need to have kind of some level of oversight about what's happening in the civilian and academic center, in academic worlds, they do provide kind of models and tools that can help those communities to kind of understand and mitigate the risks that can come from development of AI tools that might have potential military applications. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. One of the things you mentioned there is this issue of over control, and particularly when we're talking about innovation and research and dual use technologies. And a theme that has come up in the last day and a half of discussions has been how to address inequality in access in terms of AI technologies. So I'll flick to Jules and then Andrew, if I could, in relation to how to address some of these issues of inequality in regulation of these kinds of technologies, noting in particular that the success of the nuclear suppliers group and the missile control technology regime has been tied to controlling particular kinds of technology. So there are distinct haves and have-nots, but we've already mentioned that we don't necessarily want that in the space of artificial intelligence. Jules.
So if I may, I will zoom out a little bit from specifically export controls for this answer, and I will refer back to stuff that was mentioned in the plenary session this morning by the high-level representative for disarmament affairs, in which, this is a core priority of global AI governance, broadly speaking, this idea of avoiding what some call the AI divide. In the same way as we have a digital divide that basically means that there's an unequal access to digital technologies across regions and demographics. I think one of the core concerns of of people working on the global governance of AI now is to avoid an AI divide, and this is we're heading towards that divide, and I think that there are positive developments in the governance sector, and one of the things that was mentioned was the Summit for the Future is one of the next gathering, let's say the next big gathering that will try to address this issue, and also the UN Secretary General AI Advisory Body, who has a recommendation, the first recommendation that they have is specifically to find ways to avoid that, to avoid this AI divide by finding mechanisms to govern AI by and for all. So it's at the core of many of the initiatives on global AI governance.
Andrea, did you want to add to that?
Sure, but I'll be really brief because I know that we're low on time. So Again, I'll just kind of speak to the existing kind of mechanisms that are at this moment, not on the multilateral level, but at the unilateral level, and mostly, spurred in large part by the US. So one with regards to the semiconductor manufacturing equipment has been what's called ITSI, and I'm sorry, I can't remember right now what that acronym stands for, but basically it's agreements that the US it has like in parallel to the new export controls um created with certain like-minded countries in order to have cooperation and also investment on semiconductors and manufacturing equipment and packaging and different parts of the supply chain. And so that's one of the incentives. But another thing that is quite interesting to see, and that's included in this in kind of recent interim rule that touched on new controls on quantum computing items and more advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, is that within that interim rule, the US created a license exception whereby countries that that create or align their own controls with that rule will get license exceptions. And so there's kind of these a recognition that there needs to be incentives in order to have alignment of other countries with any kind of unilateral controls that the US is undertaking. And that also in parallel allows for that sharing of technology and cooperation with those like-minded partners. And then also in parallel to that, there's multilateral efforts, again, that are outside of the regimes, but that have working groups that are specific to technology innovation, like within the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity or the EU-US Trade Technology Technology Council. And we're probably going to see sort of more ways the US looks to create these incentives and share technology. Because it's not possible to embark on the unilateral controls without doing that. And so yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Andrea. And I realise I've fallen into the trap that most that work in the export control field do, and that is really focusing on what states are chasing in relation to export controls without really turning the panel's attention to the issue of collaboration with the private sector. So I'll go back to Andrea first in relation to that issue, but what kind of collaboration is necessary with the private sector to make sure that these controls are properly calibrated? We've talked about the issue of dual use technology and identifying what might need controlling, but when we're talking about private sector, if you could also break out what stakeholders we might need to engage with, that would help round out, I think, how we've addressed this issue in today's panel.
Sure. I'll try to be brief because I feel like this is something I could talk about for the next 8 hours. So one approach has been actually having collaboration with industry and bringing them into the discussion of any potential new controls. So for example, in the US, the Department of Commerce has created these they're like small working groups that are focused on specific technologies or specific kinds of items, and they bring in industry leaders and also researchers, civil society, and they discuss what the potential impact of new controls are, the state of the technology, and those are really important because they build trust and kind of buy-in from the private sector. But apart from that, and that kind of paints a sunshiny picture of everyone collaborating, there's some really, really big challenges. I mean, industry is completely overwhelmed with how many compliance responsibilities they have with export controls, with sanctions, with just new rules and new controls and designations and whatever coming out all the time. And so there is a need for kind of parallel support from the public sector, and whether that means transparency, communication, conducting outreach, not just to big companies, but small and medium-sized companies, and not just even to companies, but academic organizations. I mean, in the US, all universities have to comply just like companies because of that importance of technology. and intangible technology transfer. So they have compliance programs and are increasingly the subject of prosecution if they violate US law. And so there's just needs to be as much support as possible and kind of back and forth sort of communication and collaboration with industry to ensure that they have support and they know the rules clearly, and they also know who to call if they have questions or clarifications, and also to share best practices regarding ICPs and regarding compliance. Again, I could sort of go on, but it's so crucial to talk about industry and academia because that's where the rubber hits the road. Like that's where you can create all the regulations you want, but if they don't comply and there's no enforcement mechanism for them to comply, or to be prosecuted if they don't comply, then all of this is just talk.
Thanks, Andrea. We probably have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions because we did start a little bit late. So I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative and extend the session by 10 minutes. Did anyone have any questions for the panel?
Thank you. My name is Chewon from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I work as a researcher for economic security. I think Dr. Visky mentioned about this recent BIS IFR's reporting requirements. In Korea, we are pretty much focused on this licensing exceptions, but thank you for bringing that up. But I also remind myself that recent ongoing issues about outbound investment also requires some notification requirements. So I think reporting is really important. So can you a little bit share us about your thoughts, maybe about these implications of the reporting requirements? What will happen later on? Thank you.
I think, yeah, you wanted to talk about reporting first?
Yeah, so I would look at the big picture first. So there's clearly some relationship between this export control and also this outbound investment screening program, because I see it as, so suppose that there's only just a unilateral control from the US government, then what happens is that the example that I said earlier will happen. AMD making joint ventures with Chinese companies and then giving some key technologies that is used to design chips. So to block those kind of efforts, now that's the reason why we need outbound investment program. And then also in this kind of like new IFR that the BIS has just released, I think the stance of the BIS has like changed a bit from its like what happened in October 2022. So we really had a short period of time to like make our adjustment. It's kind of like a surprise in the industry. But now I think they're giving us some time to make some adjustment. So that's the reason why I think they are giving some license exceptions and also giving some presumption of approvals for a certain set of countries. But as I said, as I said before, I don't think this is going to be a permanent exception for selected countries, or maybe this kind of presumption of approval might not be there forever. I think depending on how the countries cope with the US system, I think these kind of giving favors in this state of a license can change. The same story applied for like outbound investment screening program as well. So depending on the election results, we don't know who is going to win. But I think Trump might be more inclined to use more stronger kind of sanctions, like secondary sanctions involved with the outbound investment program. So I'm worrying about those kind of issues, trying to bring in allies into like US systems. If we do not cope, then they have forces to make us be in their system. So yeah, so I think these trends will just go on and on.
I think we have similar experiences in Australia in the way that Australia has pushed a lot of the compliance obligations on industry and the research institutions to self-identify those kinds of capabilities that might be subject to controls. But commensurate to that, we have seen more outreach by government, particularly in light of these US exemptions that you mentioned, because Australia has been granted those, in terms of trying to educate universities and industry, with a couple of government task forces being stood up to try and address those reporting obligations, because as you also note, they're subject to constant change. They're very hard to stay on top of. Did any of you have any comments on that particular issue? Jules, Mark, Andrea? Great. We've got another question.
Hello, my name is Daniel Saror. I am a law professor in University of Chile. I would like to ask Andrea about the what's your opinion about the conflict of interest between the industry, because usually the industry is very close to the military. Usually the executive are former militaries. And how do you think we must evaluate this kind of participation, considering that they are not totally free of influences?
It's a really interesting question, and maybe an angle that isn't really discussed much, because it's kind of, at the end of the day, justified as a national security issue. And so it's kind of natural that even the industry, and specifically the defense industry that provides the military with what it needs, is kind of part of the decision, or part of these policy decisions. So I'm not really sure actually how to answer that, because I don't know if it really would change anything or be relevant to the ultimate outcome, which is, based on the country's own sort of national and security interests. But it's an interesting question.
I think we had one more question and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Heigo Sato, professor at Takushoku University, Japan. I'm not specifying who should I be questioning to, but your discussion is very interesting, but you did not touch upon the tools, which is tools in the traditional export control, which is end user control, and one of which is a deemed export control in the domestic level. If those tools have some rooms to maneuver or work in the military export controls, can you make a comment on that? Thank you very much.
Mark, did you want to comment about deemed export controls?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, deemed export controls is a kind of US term which refers to kind of transfers of technology, particularly that happen within a country. So if you're kind of non-US national in the US and you gain access to technology by working at a company, then that could potentially be subject to US export controls. Yeah, I think a lot of the kind of the new laws and regulations that already exist, and the new ones that Andrea's talked about, they kind of have applications. They have a deemed export control application. I think one of the interesting things that's happening in this space is that it's a tool which other states are also thinking about as well. It's a mechanism that's always traditionally been associated mostly with the United States, but I think within Europe, Lauren's mentioned recent developments in Australia. Other countries are also thinking about the use of export controls to regulate transfers of knowledge and technology that happen within their territory, and not just exports that go from one country to another. So yeah, again, it's definitely kind of potentially further complicating the already quite complex kind of regulatory environment here, and kind of underlines the point that Andrea is making about the kind of the level of complexity about many of these controls, and kind of goes to the point that I think we've kind of been making, which is that in order to work effectively, export controls need to be targeted on the particular kind of technologies, both in terms of software and hardware, that are really at the kind of high end have the most kind of clear potential military applications and are the ones where export controls can kind of have a meaningful impact without kind of overburdening companies and academia or disrupting too much the kind of peaceful transfer of technology. And when we think beyond that, thinking more kind of imaginatively about other governance instruments that can be brought to bear.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to ask the panelists now to summarise in 30 seconds or less the key challenges and opportunities in relation to export controls of military AI. So I'll start with Jules.
I try to do that in less than 30 seconds, going back to one of the points that I made earlier about the strategic perception of AI and strategic perception changing into competition, which to a certain extent is great. Competition is always welcome, but then we have to find ways in which we make sure that the competition doesn't become problematic for international security. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Hyuk-jung?
Okay, so as a Korean, Korea is a small country, but it has a large semiconductor industry. We have a large presence also in the semiconductor industry as well. And we have an ambition to be, one day we want to be we want to have firms like NVIDIA's and other chip designers in the world. So this issue is really important for our country, and also because we have our neighbor, North Korea. So we have a neighbor, North Korea as well, and so we right across the West Sea, we have China as well. So this is a very important issue. I think there are many things that has to be dealt from now on. So first, draw a line between what is approved use of the AI and what is not approved, and how much to control. And so I think Korea has much to say about this issue, and we want to have these kind of conversations on and on from now on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Mark, 30 seconds.
I mean, one thing that's kind of been a kind of tone, I think, to a lot of the discussion is the sense that the US is kind of driving this, and that other states are kind of being forced to kind of comply with US standards, kind of oftentimes kind of unwillingly. I think a key challenge moving forward is to kind of get beyond that and think about this as something which is being done not just because of some kind of national US security concern, but because of some kind of broader underlying kind of normative issue to do with the potential misuse of AI in military applications. So I think very much following on from what Hyuk just said, thinking about what is it, the kind of broader thing that a broad group of states agree upon are the kind of the risks here, and basing the export controls on that, and moving beyond a sense that it's being something that's being driven and kind of led exclusively by the US.
Thanks, Mark. And Andrea, 30 seconds on how to fix the problem.
Thanks. And I'm going to build on what Mark said in terms of the importance of identifying specific threats, and say that for that and identifying what tools can actually preclude or minimize those threats is important. And at the moment, there's kind of a difficulty in establishing a sound conceptual framework for what is the role of export controls? What is the role of the regimes? What is the role of sanctions? And then what are the tools of technology protection? At the moment, they're a bit muddled when it comes to some of these issues. And until that conceptual framework becomes more sound, it's going to be very difficult to get that alignment and multilateral support, as well as to have effective policy and compliance and enforcement.
Thanks, Andrea. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this session this afternoon. If you could join me to thank these fabulous panelists in giving us a quick overview and understanding of these challenges. Thank you. Mark, you can go back to bed now.
All right, bye everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea, for dialing in.
Thank you so much. Bye.